Before we dive in, let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. I've got a story that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. It's one of those moments where you don't expect a thing, and then boom, a lesson gets taught. So, are you ready? Let's dive in. It was just another ordinary evening. The kind where everything seems calm, and people go about their business without thinking that something big is about to happen. Mike Tyson, the famous boxer known for his strength and quick moves, was planning to enjoy a nice evening with his wife, Lakia Spicer. It was a rare chance for them to dress up, look sharp, and just have some fun without the worry of cameras or the spotlight. The world outside might have expected him to be a tough fighter, and he was, but tonight, he just wanted to be a regular guy, enjoying the night with his beautiful wife. Lakia, who was always by his side, was dressed in a stunning, bright red dress. It was shiny and expensive. The kind of dress that catches everyone's eye when you walk into a room. It was so bright that it almost seemed to glow. She had her hair perfectly styled and wore a warm smile that could light up the whole room. They looked like the perfect couple, ready to attend a fancy event where everyone wanted to be. But little did they know, this night wasn't going to be like any other. It wasn't going to be the peaceful night they imagined. No, this night was about to take a turn, and not the kind of turn they were expecting. Something was about to happen that would completely change everything. Mike and Lakia were heading toward an exclusive event in the city, a high-class party where important people from all walks of life came together. The place was filled with luxury and high-end fashion. The walls glittered with golden lights that danced across the room, and the sound of laughter and soft music filled the air. Everything seemed perfect, like the kind of event where no one would cause trouble. But sometimes, trouble can find you when you least expect it. As Mike and Lakia entered the venue, the crowd went silent for a moment. It wasn't every day that a celebrity like Mike Tyson walked through the door. People turned their heads, whispering in surprise and excitement. Mike was used to this kind of attention, but he wasn't the type to soak it all in. He just wanted to enjoy the night with his wife and forget about the pressure of the world. Lakia, standing next to him, looked just as stunning. She looked at Mike, giving him a smile that showed she was happy to be there with him. But there was something in the air. Not everyone in the room was welcoming. Some of the guests were more focused on the couple's entrance than others. As Mike and Lakia made their way deeper into the event, they passed by a group of men who had been standing near the back of the room. The men were dressed in police uniforms, officers who were supposed to be there for security, but instead, they were laughing, whispering, and throwing glances at the couple. They didn't know who Mike Tyson was to them. To them, he was just another guy at the event. They weren't impressed by his fame. They didn't see him as a legend or a champion. To them, he was just another person to look down on. And as they looked at Lakia's beautiful red dress, they began to laugh. They thought it was funny, like it was a joke. They didn't realize it, but they were already about to make a huge mistake. Lakia, who was used to being in the spotlight with her husband, could feel the eyes on her. She noticed the way the officers looked at her dress, whispering to each other. At first, she thought maybe it was just her imagination. But as she looked closer, she saw their faces. One of them even snickered and made a rude comment about her dress. Who wears something like that to a fancy event? It's way too much, he muttered, loud enough for her to hear. Lakia's smile didn't fade, but inside, she felt a twinge of annoyance. She wasn't the type to let things like that bother her, but she couldn't help but feel hurt by the disrespect. Mike, standing beside her, didn't seem to notice at first. He was focused on enjoying the night and spending time with his wife. But when the officers started talking louder, when their jokes became more obvious, Mike began to notice too. Mike Tyson wasn't just any man. He was known for his boxing skills, but he was also known for his pride. He would stand up for the people he cared about. His reputation was built on strength and power, but also on loyalty. If someone disrespected his family, he wasn't the kind of person to back down. And right now, these officers were crossing a line. The officers didn't know who they were dealing with. They thought that because they wore uniforms, they could make fun of anyone. But they didn't understand the kind of man Mike Tyson was. Sure, he was a champion in the ring, but his real power wasn't just in his punches. It was in his heart. Mike loved his wife deeply, and seeing her disrespected made his blood boil. He knew right then that this was not the kind of situation that was going to end quietly. They kept whispering, giggling, and making fun of Luckia's dress, unaware of what was brewing behind Mike's calm expression. He stood there, quiet, watching them. He didn't say a word, but his mind was already working. Every part of him was telling him that he couldn't let this go. The air around them grew thick with tension, and the night, which had started out so perfect, was now filled with the sound of quiet whispers, laughter, and the growing feeling that something was about to explode. Mike took a deep breath. He had been in many difficult situations before. As a fighter, he had faced opponents bigger and stronger than him. But he always knew how to stand his ground. And now, in this moment, he knew that he wasn't just protecting his wife. He was going to teach these officers a lesson they would never forget. The night was no longer just a simple evening out. It had turned into something much bigger. What started with a joke at Luckia's expense was about to become a lesson in respect, strength, and standing up for what's right. Mike glanced at Luckia. She didn't say a word, but he could see it in her eyes. She knew what was happening. She knew Mike was about to act. And she didn't stop him. She trusted him. She knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together. And so, without warning, the scene in the room began to shift. The tension in the air thickened. The officers, who thought they could get away with laughing and insulting the Tyson family, were about to learn a lesson they'd never forget. What happens next is the kind of moment you don't want to miss. A moment where a man's strength, love for his wife, and sense of justice would change the course of the night forever. So, stay with me, because things are about to get real. Mike Tyson and his wife, Luckia Spicer, walked through the grand entrance of the event hall. The moment they stepped inside, the bright flashing lights from the paparazzi hit them. Cameras clicked and flashed so fast that it was almost impossible to see clearly. The whole room seemed to freeze for a second as people looked at the famous boxer and his beautiful wife. They had entered the room like a storm, and everyone knew it. Mike Tyson had been in the spotlight for years. He was used to this attention. People looked at him with admiration, curiosity, and sometimes even fear. But tonight was different. Tonight, the spotlight was on him and Luckia, shining on them like the brightest star in the sky. The energy in the room was electric, and everyone could feel it. But while some people were excited to see them, others didn't share the same feelings. Luckia was walking proudly by Mike's side. She was wearing a stunning red dress. It was the kind of dress that made heads turn. It wasn't just red, it was bold, a deep, bright red that made her shine like a diamond. The fabric glittered under the lights, and the dress hugged her figure in the most perfect way. Her hair was styled beautifully, and she wore a confident smile that only made her look more beautiful. She was the center of attention, and she didn't mind it. Mike, too, looked sharp in his tuxedo. He was ready for the evening, hoping it would be a peaceful, fun night with his wife. But as they made their way through the crowd, things started to feel off. The crowd wasn't the only one watching them. Mike's eyes caught a small group of people in the corner of the room. They were wearing police uniforms, standing together, talking and laughing. Mike didn't think much of it at first. They were just officers, probably there for security, but something in the air felt strange. It wasn't just the usual glances or whispers. There was something darker about the way the officers were looking at them. Mike's instincts told him that something wasn't right. He could feel the tension building. It wasn't the kind of tension that comes from excitement or nervousness, it was the kind of tension that makes your skin crawl. A feeling that something bad was about to happen. But Mike didn't say anything. He kept walking, holding Luckia's hand firmly. He trusted her, and he knew she could handle whatever came their way. But even he wasn't prepared for what was about to unfold. The officers in the corner started talking more loudly. Mike could hear their whispers. They weren't saying anything nice. They were making fun of Lakia's dress. At first, it was just a few quiet comments under their breath. But then they started to laugh. They thought it was funny. Mike didn't catch all the words, but he could hear enough to know that they were mocking his wife. "Look at that dress," one of the officers sneered. "What's she think, she's some kind of queen?" Another officer snickered, "Yeah, I can't believe she's wearing that. It's too much, don't you think?" Mike's face tightened. He could feel the anger rising inside him. Lakia, however, didn't flinch. She didn't let their rude comments get to her. She was used to people talking behind her back. She had been through worse before. But Mike wasn't used to hearing anyone talk like that about the woman he loved. His heart began to race, and a part of him wanted to turn around, confront those officers, and teach them a lesson. But he kept his cool. He kept walking, one step at a time, closer to the center of the room. Lakia could feel the tension too, even though she tried not to show it. She didn't say anything to Mike, but she knew what he was thinking. She could tell by the way he was gripping her hand. She had been in enough situations to know when something was wrong. She knew Mike was getting angry. But what could she do? She had learned over the years that sometimes the best way to handle a situation was to stay calm and not give in to the anger. But deep down, she knew it wasn't going to be that easy. As they continued to walk, the officers seemed to get bolder. The jokes became louder. The laughter more obvious. And then, one of the officers, a tall man with a wide grin on his face, took it a step too far. "You know," he said, loud enough for Mike and Lakia to hear, "it looks like a circus tent. I don't know who she thinks she's fooling with that dress." The others around him laughed even louder, and the man nudged his friend as if it was the funniest thing he had ever heard. Mike stopped walking. His eyes narrowed, and his lips pressed into a tight line. His whole body tensed, and Lakia, feeling the change in him, stopped too. She looked at Mike, but he didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. Lakia, ever the graceful woman, didn't react either. But she knew the situation was escalating. Mike was not the type of person who let things slide, especially when it came to his family. The officers didn't know who they were messing with. They didn't know that when you disrespect Mike Tyson's family, you're not just facing a boxer, you're facing a man who would protect those he loved at all costs. The officer who had made the joke about Lakia's dress looked over at Mike and gave him a sarcastic smile, like he was daring him to do something. He thought Mike was too calm, too laid back. He thought that because Mike had been famous for a long time, he was soft. But that was where the officer was wrong. Mike had been in the ring with some of the toughest fighters in the world, and he wasn't afraid of a little disrespect. What the officer didn't understand was that this wasn't about fighting. This was about something bigger, respect. Mike took a deep breath and turned to Lakia. "Let's just keep walking," he said quietly. But Lakia could tell that Mike was holding back. She could see the fire in his eyes, the anger bubbling just under the surface. She knew he didn't like seeing her treated this way. But she also knew Mike. He didn't rush into things. He was patient, but when he was ready, there was no stopping him. They moved through the crowd, but Mike's eyes never left the group of officers. His mind was racing, calculating. He could feel the eyes of the room on them, but his focus was completely on the officers who had disrespected his wife. He knew they were just small-minded men who thought they could get away with anything. But they had no idea what kind of trouble they had just stepped into. The room was filled with the sound of soft music, people talking, and laughter, but Mike's world felt quieter. The louder the officers laughed, the more his anger built. Every time one of them opened their mouths, it was like a weight was being added to his shoulders. He could feel it in his chest, the tightness that came with anger. He was trying his best to ignore it, but it was hard. Very hard. Lakia squeezed Mike's hand, looking up at him. She didn't want to make the situation worse, but she knew something had to be done. She trusted Mike, and she knew that whatever happened, they would face it together. She could feel his body shaking slightly, the tension in him growing. "I think they're trying to get a reaction out of you," Lakia said quietly. "But you don't need to give them the satisfaction, Mike." Mike nodded but didn't respond. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't let it go. He wasn't going to let these officers make fun of his wife and walk away without facing some kind of consequence. Not tonight. Not ever. The tension in the room grew thicker as the officers continued to make fun of Lakia's dress. It was clear they were enjoying themselves. But what they didn't realize was that every joke, every mocking word, was pushing Mike closer and closer to a breaking point. The calm exterior he had was fading. His anger was building, and the officers were about to see that they had made a big mistake. The officers were still laughing. They didn't notice how Mike Tyson's eyes were slowly narrowing, or how Lakia's grip on his hand was tightening. It was almost as if they thought that Mike and Lakia were too calm to do anything about their rude behavior. They didn't know it yet, but that was the biggest mistake they could have made. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Mike Tyson wasn't just a boxer, he was a man of principle. He had been through a lot in his life, and he had seen the worst of people. He had spent years fighting not only in the ring but also to prove to the world that he wasn't a man to be messed with. People didn't always understand that about him. They only saw his anger, his punches, his strength. But behind all that, Mike had a quiet wisdom. He knew when to hold back and when to step forward. And right now, he was holding back. He wasn't going to react just yet. He wasn't going to give the officers the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. But inside, his mind was racing. His thoughts were spinning faster than a boxer in the ring. Every laugh from the officers felt like a punch to his pride, to his family, to his wife. And the more they laughed, the more Mike's patience thinned. Lakia, on the other hand, wasn't someone who let people push her around either. She had grown up tough. She wasn't about to let a few jokes ruin her night, especially when it was clear that these officers were trying to bait her and Mike into a confrontation. She had seen this kind of thing before, people making fun of others to feel powerful, to feel important. But Lakia knew better. She knew that standing tall in the face of such disrespect was the real power. So she stayed calm. She stayed strong. She wouldn't let their words bother her. She refused to let them see that they had any power over her. Instead, she turned her attention back to Mike, making sure her presence gave him the support he needed. But the officers didn't stop. The jokes kept coming. They weren't just about Lakia's dress anymore. They were laughing at her, mocking her, treating her like she was nothing. And that was when something shifted in the air. The tension was getting thicker, and the room seemed to slow down, as if time was pausing to take note of the moment. Mike Tyson stood there, his body as still as a statue, but his mind was working faster than ever. He wasn't reacting yet, but he was not going to let this go on. His eyes were locked on the officers, studying them carefully. He was watching how they moved, how they laughed, how they underestimated him and his wife. Every small detail was being stored away in his mind. Every comment they made added fuel to the fire burning inside of him. It wasn't just about the dress anymore. It wasn't even just about respect. It was about showing these officers that they couldn't get away with treating people like this. Lakia felt the change in Mike. She could see the fire starting to burn in his eyes, but she knew he wasn't ready to act yet. She had been with Mike long enough to understand when he was about to do something big. She could tell that this wasn't the time to push him. He would make his move when he was ready. Meanwhile, the officers were still mocking them. They had no idea how badly they were pushing Mike Tyson's buttons. They were so focused on their jokes, on making fun of the way Lakia looked, that they didn't notice the warning signs. Mike's silence. The way his jaw clenched. The way he was breathing in slow, controlled breaths. But what they didn't know was that Mike was a master of control. He didn't get angry quickly. He didn't lash out the moment someone said something rude. No, Mike took his time. He waited. He calculated. And in that moment, the officers were giving him exactly what he needed, time. Time to make them regret underestimating him. As Mike stood there, still and silent, he couldn't help but think back to everything that had brought him here. His rise to fame. The years of training. The fights in the ring. He had always been pushed to his limits. He had always been tested. And now, in this moment, it felt like another test. But this time, it wasn't in a ring. This time, it was about something much bigger, his family, his honor, and his pride. Lucia, sensing the growing tension in Mike, squeezed his hand again. She didn't need to say anything. Her touch was enough. It was a reminder to Mike that no matter what happened next, they were in this together. She was his partner, his equal. And if it came down to it, she would stand by him no matter what. But the officers didn't see it that way. They kept talking. They didn't stop their jokes, their laughter, or their disrespect. It was as if they thought they were invincible, untouchable. They didn't think Mike Tyson would do anything. They thought that because he had a reputation for being calm and collected, he wouldn't do anything about their taunts. But this was Mike Tyson. And he wasn't going to let anyone disrespect his family. Not now. Not ever. The more they mocked, the more Mike's resolve grew. He wasn't the same person he had been when he was younger. He had changed. He had learned. He wasn't about to let his temper control him. But he wasn't going to stand by and let these officers disrespect his wife, either. And then, as the officers started laughing once more, one of them did something that crossed the line. One of the officers, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, walked up to Lucia and made a snide comment about her dress. "You really think you can impress anyone with that?" he sneered, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. It was the final straw. Mike Tyson turned to face the officer. His eyes locked onto him, and for a moment, everything else in the room faded away. It was just Mike, the officer, and Lucia. Lucia squeezed Mike's hand tighter, sensing the change in him. She could see the fire in his eyes now, and it was impossible to ignore. She knew this was the moment. Mike took a step forward. The room seemed to quiet down as everyone turned their attention to him. People could feel that something big was about to happen. They didn't know exactly what Mike was going to do, but they knew that nothing was going to be the same after this. The officer looked at Mike, his face smug, thinking that Mike was all talk. But Mike wasn't about to talk anymore. In that moment, Mike Tyson made a decision. He wasn't going to let the disrespect continue. He wasn't going to let anyone mock his wife, not in front of him. And as Mike stepped forward, the officers realized they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. The tension in the room was thick. Everyone could feel it. The air felt heavier, like something big was about to happen. The officers were still laughing, thinking that they had the upper hand. They thought they had made their point, that Mike and Lucia were nothing but people to mock. They had no idea what was coming. But then it happened. Mike Tyson, who had been standing still and silent, suddenly moved. The calm expression on his face shifted just slightly, enough for everyone in the room to see it. It was as if a storm had appeared out of nowhere. There was no rage in his eyes, but there was a quiet power that sent chills down the spines of the officers who had been laughing at him and his wife. In a flash, Mike moved closer to them. His presence was undeniable. The room seemed to hold its breath. The officers, who had been so sure of themselves moments ago, now looked unsure. The air around them felt heavy, like they were about to be caught in something they couldn't escape from. Mike didn't need to shout or raise his voice. His tone was low, but everyone could hear it. It was strong, commanding, and carried with it the weight of years of experience. "You think that's funny," he said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet strength. "Let me show you what happens when you mess with the wrong people." The officers, for the first time, didn't know what to do. Their smirks began to fade, their laughter dying down. They tried to play it cool, to pretend that they weren't scared, but Mike's words hit them like a ton of bricks. They didn't expect this. They thought they could laugh at him and his wife, mock them, and get away with it. But Mike wasn't the same man they had imagined. Mike wasn't just a boxer. He wasn't just someone who fought in rings. No, Mike Tyson had learned more than just how to punch. He had learned about people, about respect, and about standing up for what's right. He knew when to stay quiet, when to be calm, and when it was time to teach a lesson. And this was one of those times. The officers looked at each other nervously, realizing that they had pushed too far. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They had no idea that Mike Tyson, with his calm exterior, was capable of making them pay for what they had done. They were used to seeing him in the ring, a powerful figure who could knock someone out with a single punch. But what they didn't realize was that Mike Tyson's power wasn't just in his fists. His power was in his mind, his ability to stay calm in the face of danger, and his ability to make people feel the weight of his presence. Mike's presence was undeniable. The room seemed to shrink as everyone turned their attention to him. Even the air felt like it was being sucked out of the room, as if everyone could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The officers, who had been so full of themselves moments ago, now seemed small and vulnerable. They had underestimated Mike Tyson, and now they were about to pay the price. As Mike took another step toward them, the officers backed up, their faces no longer full of arrogance. They tried to act tough, but their voices were shaky. They didn't know what Mike was going to do, but they knew they had pushed him too far. One of the officers, the one who had made the cruel joke about Lucky's dress, opened his mouth to say something. But Mike was quicker. Before the officer could get a word out, Mike's eyes locked onto him. The officer froze. He could feel the intensity of Mike's gaze, and it was enough to make him second-guess everything he had just said. "I don't think you understand," Mike said, his voice still calm but filled with power. "It's not about the dress. It's about respect. You've crossed a line. And now, you'll see what happens when people like you make fun of people like us." The officer stammered, his tough exterior completely gone. "We didn't mean any harm," he said weakly, but Mike wasn't having it. He didn't care about excuses or apologies. He cared about making sure they learned a lesson they would never forget. Mike stepped even closer, now only a few feet away from the officer. The tension in the room was at its peak. No one moved. No one breathed. Everyone was watching, waiting for the next move. And then, it happened. Mike Tyson's hand shot out. But it wasn't a punch. It wasn't violence. It was something else. He grabbed the officer's wrist, not with force but with precision. The officer tried to pull away, but Mike's grip was like iron. The officer's face turned pale, his bravado completely gone. He had no idea what to do. He had never been in a situation like this before. "I don't need to fight you to teach you a lesson," Mike said, his voice still calm but filled with power. "I just need to show you that not everyone you meet is going to let you get away with being disrespectful. Not everyone is going to laugh it off. Some people fight with their minds, with their presence." The officer didn't know how to respond. He just stood there, frozen, caught in Mike's grip. And that's when he realized that Mike wasn't just a boxer. Mike was a man who had been through more than most people could ever imagine. He had fought his way through life, through struggles, through pain, and now, he was showing these officers the consequences of their actions. The rest of the officers watched, unsure of what to do. They had all been part of this, laughing and mocking, but now they saw that they had made a serious mistake. They had no idea what kind of person they were messing with. They thought Mike Tyson was just a boxer, but now they saw that he was so much more. And just like that, Mike released the officer's wrist. He didn't need to do anything more. The lesson had been taught. The officer, now humiliated, took a step back, his face flushed with embarrassment. The room was silent. Mike turned to Lykia, who had been standing behind him, watching everything unfold. She looked at him, her eyes full of admiration and pride. Mike had done it. He had shown the officers exactly what they had coming to them. He had shown them that it wasn't just about muscle or fists, it was about standing up for what's right, about having the strength to stay calm and take control of a situation. The officers didn't say anything more. They didn't need to. They knew they had lost. They had crossed a line, and now they were paying for it. Mike Tyson had shown them the power of respect and the consequences of mocking someone just because they thought they could get away with it. And with that, Mike turned, and he and Lykia walked away. The lesson had been taught, and the officers would never forget it. The room was still filled with a heavy silence, but there was something different about it now. It wasn't the same silence that had filled the air earlier, the kind that made everyone feel uncomfortable. No, this silence was more like a quiet understanding. Something had changed. The officers had messed with the wrong people, and now they were facing the consequences. As Mike Tyson's powerful presence settled in the room, the officers who had once felt so confident began to back away. Their smirks had disappeared. The arrogance that had once made them feel like they were above everyone else now seemed completely out of place. They were no longer in control. Mike had taken that power from them without ever needing to raise a hand. It was all in the way he held himself. His calm confidence was enough to make anyone take a step back and think twice about their actions. The officers, who had spent the night mocking and disrespecting Mike and his wife, Lykia, were now being escorted out of the event by security. They didn't argue or try to fight back. There was no point in doing that anymore. They knew they had crossed a line, and they had no choice but to leave with their heads down. The crowd watched as they were led away, and though no one said anything, everyone knew exactly what had just happened. The officers had learned their lesson the hard way. Lykia, standing next to Mike, didn't need to say a word. Her strength and grace were enough. She stood tall, her head held high, and in that moment, she didn't have to prove anything to anyone. She didn't need to shout or argue. The way she held herself spoke volumes. It showed that she was someone who knew her worth, someone who wouldn't let anyone disrespect her, not even in a room full of people who thought they could get away with it. Mike turned to her, and for the first time that night, there was a genuine smile on his face. It was a soft, knowing smile, one that said everything without needing to say a word. He was proud of her. He was proud of how she had handled herself through the whole situation. And in that moment, he wasn't just proud of her for standing tall. He was proud of the fact that they had both shown everyone in that room what true strength really was. "No one touches my family," Mike said quietly, his voice calm but filled with authority. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made everyone listen. His tone wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. His words were strong enough to cut through the tension in the air, and everyone could hear the truth in them. Lykia looked up at him, and for a moment, everything felt right. There was a sense of peace that settled between them. The night had started out with tension, with a feeling that things were about to go wrong, but now it felt like everything had come full circle. The officers had been removed. The lesson had been taught. And now, they were walking away, their heads low, their pride shattered. The crowd around them, who had watched the whole thing unfold, began to murmur. Some of them were shocked, some of them were impressed, but all of them were quiet. It wasn't often that someone stood up in the face of disrespect and taught a lesson that everyone would remember. But that's exactly what Mike and Lykia had done. They had shown everyone in that room that there was always a price to pay when you think you can bully someone or make fun of them. There was always someone who would step up and make sure you learned your lesson. And that was the message that Mike had sent to the officers, To everyone in the room, and to anyone who was watching, respect isn't something that should be taken lightly. You can't just take people for granted or think that you can treat them however you want. There are always consequences, and there will always be someone who will stand up and show you that there's a line you don't cross. As the officers were led out, the energy in the room shifted. The mood had changed completely. What had started as a night full of tension and disrespect had now turned into a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up for what's right. The crowd, who had watched the whole ordeal unfold, was now seeing things in a new light. They understood what had happened, and they respected Mike and Lakia even more for how they had handled the situation. Mike turned his attention back to Lakia. He didn't need to say anything else. His words had already made their point. The officers were gone, and they had been made to pay for their actions. There was nothing left to say. They had been humbled. They had been shown the consequences of disrespect. The two of them stood there for a moment, just taking it all in. The event had gone from a simple evening out to a powerful moment of justice. But Mike and Lakia weren't focused on the drama that had just unfolded. They were focused on each other. They knew that no matter what happened around them, they had each other's backs. They were a team. They always had been. "We did it," Lakia said quietly, her eyes meeting Mike's. Her voice wasn't filled with pride or arrogance. It was calm, almost serene. She wasn't boasting. She was just acknowledging the fact that they had stood up for themselves. They had shown the officers and everyone else that no one could mess with them. Mike nodded, his smile growing a little wider. "We sure did." And with that, they turned and walked away from the scene, leaving behind the officers who had been forced to face the consequences of their actions. The lesson had been taught, and it had been learned. Mike and Lakia had stood their ground, and they had made sure that no one would forget what had happened that night. They had shown the power of quiet strength, of standing up for what's right without needing to shout or fight. As they left the event, the world outside seemed brighter. It was as if everything had fallen into place. They had taken control of the situation, and they had done it in a way that left no room for doubt. The night had started with disrespect, but it had ended with justice. Mike and Lakia knew that they didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They had already done it. They had shown the officers, the crowd, and everyone else that respect was something that could never be taken for granted. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Sometimes, in life, we find ourselves in situations where things feel unfair or when others try to put us down. It could be at school, at work, or even in the simplest moments of life. You might think that the loudest voices, the ones who stand out, are the ones you need to worry about. But what if I told you that sometimes, it's the quiet ones, the ones who you don't think will speak up, that you need to watch out for? Take Mike Tyson, for example. He's known as one of the most powerful and fearless boxers in the world. But what many people don't realize is that Mike wasn't just strong because of his fists. No, Mike's true strength came from something much deeper. It came from his heart, his mind, and his ability to stand up for what was right. That night, when those officers thought they could disrespect Mike's wife, Lakia, and get away with it, they didn't expect what would happen next. They thought Mike would just get angry or fight back with violence. They thought they could hide behind their badges and make fun of Lakia without facing any consequences. But what they didn't understand was that Mike wasn't like them. He didn't need to use his fists or raise his voice to show that what they did was wrong. No, his presence, his dignity, and his love for his wife spoke louder than anything else. His calm, confident way of handling the situation made it clear that there are times when the strongest thing you can do is simply stand your ground and show respect for the people you love. When we think about the world and the way people treat each other, it's easy to believe that the loudest voices are the ones that will win. It's easy to think that the ones who shout the most or push others around are the ones who are truly in control. But the truth is, that's not always the case. Sometimes, the loudest voices are just covering up a lack of real strength. The ones who stand quietly and calmly in the face of disrespect, that's where the real power is. And when it comes to disrespect, this story teaches us an important lesson: you should never underestimate the quiet ones, the ones who don't always fight back right away. You don't know what they might be thinking, or how strong they really are. They might be watching, waiting for the right moment to show you that what you're doing is wrong. The officers in this story thought they could get away with tearing someone down, just because they thought they had power. They believed that no one would stand up to them. But they learned the hard way that everyone has limits. Everyone has a point where enough is enough. Mike Tyson, a man who was feared in the ring, showed them that the biggest lesson often comes when you least expect it. The officers thought they were untouchable, but in the end, they were the ones who ended up learning the lesson of a lifetime. This story isn't just about Mike Tyson or the officers. It's a lesson for all of us. The next time you think about disrespecting someone, whether it's a friend, a classmate, or anyone you meet, remember this story. Think about how easily things can turn around, and how someone you might think is weak or too quiet could be the one who teaches you the biggest lesson you'll ever learn. We've all been in situations where someone tries to push us down or make us feel small. And while it's natural to feel upset or angry when that happens, it's important to remember that there's always a way to stand up for yourself without being rude or hurting others. Mike Tyson didn't fight those officers with his fists. He fought them with his presence, with his strength of character, and with his love for his wife. He showed that you don't have to stoop to the level of others when they try to put you down. Sometimes, simply standing tall and staying calm is the strongest thing you can do. As we go through life, we will meet people who try to tear us down or make fun of us for being different. But we shouldn't let their words control us. We shouldn't let their actions make us feel less than we are. Just like Mike Tyson and Lakia, we all have the ability to rise above the negativity. We have the power to stand up for ourselves and the people we love. We don't need to shout or fight. We can simply show the world that we are strong and that we won't let anyone take away our dignity. And for those who think they can treat others badly without facing any consequences, well, they're usually the ones who end up with the biggest lesson. They may think they can get away with it, but in the end, the lesson will always come back to them. No one can escape the truth forever. So, the next time you see someone being put down or mistreated, remember Mike Tyson's story. Remember that there's always someone who will step in and make sure justice is served. When you're kind, when you stand up for others, and when you refuse to let people get away with treating others badly, you become the person who is truly in control. You become the one who shows that real strength doesn't come from power or force. It comes from love, from dignity, and from standing up for what's right. So, let this story be a reminder for all of us. A reminder that sometimes the biggest lesson comes when we least expect it. A reminder that when we stand up for each other, when we show kindness, and when we refuse to let others be mistreated, we make the world a better place. And just like Mike Tyson, we can all find our own way to teach the world that respect and love will always win in the end.